so please come. Now for this evening's program. History doesn't have to be dull, and politics is not always ruthless, especially when we think of the many funny things public figures have said. This is the idea behind tonight's presentation. Our speakers are two retired UCF professors, David Jordan of the History Department and our own Jerry Schuhorst, Professor Emeritus of English. David, a native of upstate New York, received his undergraduate and graduate education at the University of South Florida and has been a university administrator as well as instructor in American history at the University of Central Florida. Jerry Schuhorst was born and educated in St. Louis, received his PhD from Washington University, and he taught for 33 years at UCF, where he is a professor emeritus of English. He has given various talks at the club over the past 10 years. Jerry and David last teamed up for a first part of historical humor at the University Club in 2005. Now, after more than 3 years of further research, they're back with more one-liners, anecdotes, and amusing tidbits of political wit and historical humor, part 2. We're happy to welcome them back. Please welcome David Jordan and Jerry Schuhorst.
Thank you, Joe. Nice to be back. So settled here. This is David, by the way. I'm Jerry, in case you don't know.
Well, Joe, I wish my mother and father had been here to hear that introduction. It was very kind. My father would have enjoyed it. My mother would have believed it.
Well, we are happy to be back. I like to think that we're Winter Park's answer to the Capitol Steps, the comedy show. I'd like to think that. It's a comedy show on NPR, in case you haven't heard it, that's quite outrageous. The exception is that we don't sing, and we don't deal with current political events for the most part either.
So we're really nothing like the Capitol Steps. That's
well, I guess you're right, David. Now that I think about it, the long presidential campaign of 2008, which I'm sure you agreed never seemed to end, provided plenty of material for satirists and comedians. Just think of all the oddball things that were said and how many more amusing surprises we can look forward to in the next 4 years, even without Sarah Palin in Washington. Of course, the issues couldn't be more serious and alarming than they are right now, all the more reason for humor. But the candidates themselves generally are not expected to be funny, at least intentionally funny, unless they go on Saturday Night Live or the Letterman Show or some other program. It wasn't always so. There was a time not too long ago when public figures would often show their human side by saying amusing things, often aimed at themselves. These anecdotes are worth sharing, especially with students in history classes. If you remember your high school history class, and if it was anything like mine, it was more likely a kind of dreary account of battles and dates and dead presidents. Remember that? When I met David Jordan some years ago, and he told me how he used amusing anecdotes, one-liners, and even funny accents to bring American history to life in his classes, I realized that if more history classes followed his example, students would see history as a story of human beings, which I think it is. I also realized that we could put together a program of some of the intentionally and unintentionally funny things that political leaders have said, and we did that. And since our last presentation nearly 4 years ago, we found all kinds of new material that, mixed in with a few of the old stories from last time, have given us enough material to fill several hours, but we promise to keep this within limits, so don't get alarmed. I have also learned many things about our past political leaders that I never knew. For example, Woodrow Wilson, who always struck me as starchy looking and very serious in the textbooks, actually had a wicked sense of humor. He wrote limericks. And I know David has learned a lot too.
Jerry, before I begin, I'd like to ask the audience a question. And if you know the answer, please hold it until the end of the program. Now here's the question. Does anybody know who was the famous entertainer who ran for president in 1940 and the name of his or her party? The entertainer who ran for president in 1940, and what was the name of his or her party, even though you're too young to remember that far back. Now, if you know it, just think about it, and at the end of the program, I'll ask, and we'll see what marvelous prize and trip you may win. Many people do not think of Lincoln, the great emancipator, as a man of wit and humor. Yet he said he would trade the presidency for the talent to write better jokes. I never did like to work, he wrote, and I don't deny it. I'd rather read, tell stories, crack jokes, talk, laugh, anything but work. No doubt laughter was a relief from his depression. He could be spontaneously funny. When Stephen Douglas, for an example, in one of their great debates, called him two-faced, Lincoln replied, "If I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this one?" A favorite story Lincoln enjoyed telling concerned a man who was visiting an insane asylum where he met an inmate who insisted on a salute, saying, "I am Julius Caesar." When the visitor saw the inmate again later, the madman again demanded a salute, saying, "I am Napoleon Bonaparte." "Yes, Napoleon, but a moment ago you told me you were Julius Caesar." "Yes," he replied, "but that was by a different mother." Once, when his entire cabinet, except for one member, was against him, Lincoln told the story of the drunk at the Illinois revival meeting. The drunk was sleeping when the preacher asked, "Who are on the Lord's side?" And everyone except the sleeping drunk rose. And after the preacher asked, "Who are on the side of the devil?" the man awoke, rose, and standing alone said, "I don't exactly understand the question, but I'll stand by you, parson, to the last. But it seems to me we're in a hopeless minority."
Lack of I thought I'd use this microphone. Turn it on first. Huh? That'd be a good idea. Maybe I won't use it. I'll just go back to this one. Lack of respect for the vice presidency is a theme that runs through much American political lore. Some of the vice presidents were obscure, deservedly so, and some were funny, like Woodrow Wilson's vice president, Thomas Marshall, who once said, "A mother had two sons. One ran away to sea, and the other became vice president and was never heard from again." Until the time of Al Gore, as you know, most vice presidents did little but attend funerals, attend banquets, and wait for the president to die. Will Rogers once offered to save, quote, "some poor Democrat the embarrassment of running for the job," end quote, by offering himself. He said he was well qualified, quote, "I'm a fair eater, and I'm good enough liar to be vice president." We'll come back to Will Rogers later.
Since the time of Ronald Reagan, the level of political humor has declined on the national scene. Reagan endeared himself to many people, including those who disliked his ideas, because of his wit, often used at his own expense. Americans have always admired leaders who don't take themselves too seriously. Reagan wove humor into the fabric of his speeches. Now this humor is different from the wit of JFK, which was best seen in his spontaneous quips and comebacks, especially at press conferences. Known for taking it easy in the White House, Reagan quipped, It's true, hard work never killed anybody, but I figure why take the chance? And responding to comments about his dozing off at meetings, I left orders to be awakened at any time in case of national emergency, even if I'm in a cabinet meeting. 4 years earlier, campaigning against Jimmy Carter, he said, "Recession is when a neighbor loses his job. Depression is when you lose yours, and recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his." Right. On another occasion, he said, "Politics is supposed to be the second oldest profession. I have come to realize that it bears a very close resemblance to the first."
I'm sure you remember Bob Dole, the Republican who was defeated by Bill Clinton and known for a kind of sarcastic wit. Well, he put together a book of a presidential humor that we relied on for our research. He puts Lincoln, Reagan, and the two Roosevelts at the top and Millard Fillmore at the bottom. No one remembers anything about Millard Fillmore, which is probably just as well. Oddly enough, Gerald Ford, who recently left the scene, often came up with unintentionally funny things to say and is much more memorably quoted than Clinton, Carter, and other recent presidents. Sometimes when he was on his own without the benefit of speechwriters, Ford came up with doozies like this one. "If Lincoln were alive today, he'd be turning in his grave." Sort of like Yogi Berra. Ford was able to poke fun at his supposed physical clumsiness, especially on the golf course. "I know I am getting better at golf," he said, "because I'm hitting fewer spectators." Now, he had been, of course, an outstanding athlete at the University of Michigan, and many years later said something odd for a president of the United States. He said, "If I had gone into professional football, the name Jerry Ford might have been a household name today."
Ford's best witticism. "The three-martini lunch is the epitome of American efficiency. Where else can you get an earful, a bellyful, and a snootful at the same time?"
You remember Hubert Horatio Humphrey, senator from Minnesota, vice president under Lyndon Johnson? Well, he liked to talk and talk and talk, and he called it the politics of happiness. In 1968, we needed a certain amount of happiness. Anyway, he uttered this classic line: "Behind every successful man is a proud wife and a surprised mother-in-law." Now it's time to turn to John F. Kennedy, not only because of his unique wit, but because David does an enviable impression.
While gearing up for the presidential campaign of 1960, John F. Kennedy said, "I dreamed that the good Lord touched me on the shoulder and said, 'Don't worry, Jack, you'll be the Democratic nominee, and what's more, you'll be elected.' I had told Senator Symington about my dream. Funny thing," he said, "I had the same dream myself. We both told about our dreams to Lyndon Johnson, who was also seeking the nomination that year. And Johnson said, 'That's funny. For the life of me, I can't remember tapping either one of you two boys for the job.'" During the campaign against Richard Nixon, Kennedy said, "Mr. Nixon, in the past 7 days, has called me an economic ignoramus, a Pied Piper, and all the rest. I've just confined myself to calling him a Republican, but he says that is getting it too low." JFK was a master of good timing, seen most famously at his press conferences. When asked why he would appoint his brother Robert as Attorney General, despite his lack of the usual credentials, Kennedy replied, "Well, I don't see anything wrong with giving Bobby a little experience before he starts to practice law." At a gridiron dinner just after the 1960 election, responding to charges that his father had made the election possible by his contributions in Chicago and elsewhere. Chicago. Imagine that. JFK deftly diffused the problem with wit. I've just received the following telegram from my generous daddy. It says, "Dear Jack, don't buy a single vote more than necessary. I'll be damned if I'm going to pay for a landslide."
To go back a little bit further in history, the time that I was in high school and Adlai Stevenson was running against Stevenson, he always seemed to me, against Eisenhower, excuse me, he always seemed such a refined, elegant sort of man to be in politics. He certainly was a great speaker, had a fine wit and intelligence, almost too classy to be in office. Most of him remember his remark upon being defeated by Ike when he said, "I am too old to cry, too hurt to laugh," which he borrowed from Lincoln. He also said, "Accuracy to a newspaper is what virtue is to a lady, but a newspaper can always print a retraction." A politician is a statesman, he said, who approaches every question with an open mouth. I like that little twist at the end there. And, he said, a hypocrite is the kind of politician who would cut down a redwood tree, then mount the stump to make a speech for conservation.
Stevenson made the following proposition to his Republican colleagues who were complaining about too much negative campaigning. "If they stop telling lies about the Democrats, we will stop telling the truth about them." You can see that he enjoyed playing with paradox. Man does not live by words alone, despite the fact that sometimes he has to eat them. Now here's a favorite one of mine of Adlai, and it's really, I think, quite, you can really see into the wit of Stevenson. He'd given a speech in the Midwest, in the upper Midwest, and when he got through, this woman ran up excitedly from the audience and said, "Oh, Governor, that was a wonderful speech. Every thinking person in America will vote for you." And he said, "Madam, it'll take more than that. I'll need a majority."
The world of political wit lost one of its most gifted and colorful characters about a year ago, I think it was February, with the death of William F. Buckley, Jr., who, I'm trying to do a slight imitation of him right now. I don't know if I'll make it as successfully as my colleague, but with expressive eyebrows, darting tongue, and an amazing sesquipedalian vocabulary, which means that he always liked big words. He could disarm even liberals with a certain serpentine charm that he had. Even though the lofty tone that he used would bother people, he ran a totally improbable campaign for mayor of New York in the 1960s and was asked what he would do if elected, and he said, "Demand a recount." And asked what his role was with the Reagan White House, since he was on the phone regularly with his friend Ronnie, he had a one-word response, very unusual: ventriloquist.
Any of you folks from Deltona, if you are from Deltona, you may appreciate this. Everett McKinley Dirksen, who used to have a winter residence up there, I believe. Everett McKinley Dirksen, minority leader in the Senate when the Democrats were in power in the 1960s, was, with his wild hair and colorful style, an unforgettable figure on the public stage. He would have made a good actor. The Illinois Republican once declared, "When a member of the House moves over to the Senate, he raises the IQ of both bodies." Now here's one of my favorites, Teddy Roosevelt, and he pronounced it Roosevelt, not Roosevelt, Roosevelt. But Teddy Roosevelt, who was skilled as an orator and author, was noted for laughing with the same gusto and energy he used in talking. Teddy was also witty. For example, he said, "A man who has never gone to school may steal from a freight car, But if he has a university education, he may steal the whole railroad. And since corruption in government never ceases, this remark by TR will probably never be dated. Quote, when they call the roll in the Senate, the members don't know whether to answer present or not guilty. Colonel Teddy Roosevelt often received pleas for help from his Rough Riders, whom he commanded during the Spanish-American War of 1898. He once quoted one of these, "Dear Colonel, I am in trouble. I shot a lady in the eye, but I did not intend to hit the lady. I was shooting at my wife." There is a wonderful story of the time when TR found himself being interrupted by a drunk while campaigning. Now, this is, again, in the upper Midwest. Finally, he kept shouting, "I am a Democrat, I am a Democrat." And Roosevelt finally, annoyed enough, stopped in the middle of his speech, and he turned to the man who was down in the front row. You know, they didn't have megaphones in those days. You had to shout, and he could shout, but he had a high-pitched voice. And he said to the drunk, "May I ask the gentleman why he is a Democrat?" "Well," replied the drunk, "my grandfather was a Democrat, and so was my father. So I am a Democrat." TR replied, "Well then, sir, let me ask you this. My friend, suppose your grandfather had been a jackass and your father had been a jackass. What would you be?" The man shot back immediately, "A Republican." Now I want to talk a little bit here about the friendship that Theodore Roosevelt had with Booker T. Washington. In fact, when Roosevelt became president in 1901, when McKinley was assassinated, the first person he invited to the White House for dinner was Booker T. Washington. But you can imagine he was excoriated by the press for that, especially the Southern press. And I need not explain what they could have said and when indeed really did say. But he enjoyed going up to his home in Oyster Bay, Long Island, called Sagamore Hill. I don't know whether anyone has been to Sagamore Hill here, but you can really appreciate the man, the personality of TR when you go to Sagamore Hill. That's Roosevelt. And one day he was out riding and doing things that TR did, and three or four guests were Ray Stannard Baker, the writer of the Times, and they were invited into the library, and the president was late. But let me read this to you because it'll give you a little bit of background before this funny incident. Roosevelt, by the way, never invited Booker T. Washington to the White House again, but they kept up a very close friendship and correspondence. And every time a federal office was to be filled in the South, or something needed, a candidate needed to be recommended, he'd write Washington to find out what Booker T's attitude was about it. A servant showed the visitors into the library. Roosevelt was nowhere to be seen. They sat for a while under the varnished gaze of Theodore Sr., absorbing an aura of well-handled books, oak and mahogany. On the desk, radiant with sun slanting in through gauze curtains, there lay a gold miner's pan, a silver dagger, and an inkwell ornamented with a little bust of Abraham Lincoln. Bearskin snarled silently on the floor. Somewhere a clock was ticking. It was well past noon. Like a sudden explosion, the president blew in through the door. He looked ruddy and healthy in knickerbockers, wore a worn gray shirt and scuffed hiking shoes, and was bursting with mirth. In his hand he carried a note and a newspaper clipping. "I want to read you something I have just got," he said, "in connection with conditions in the South." The note was from Booker T. Washington. "My dear Mr. President, the enclosed is a true story." Roosevelt turned to the clipping from the Baltimore Herald. An old Florida colonel met Booker T. Washington and in a bibulous burst of confidence said to the Negro educator, "Sir, I am glad to meet you. Always wanted to shake your hand, sir. I think, sir, you're the greatest man in America." "Oh, no," said Mr. Washington, "oh, no." "You are, sir," said the colonel, and then pugnaciously, "Who's greater?" "Well," said the founder of Tuskegee, "there's President Roosevelt." "No, sir," roared the colonel, "not by a jugful. I used to think so, but since he invited you to dinner, I think he's a damn scoundrel."
Well, during the Great Depression, humor was an essential coping mechanism, as you can well understand. In 1933, the Marx Brothers produced Duck Soup, and that was a huge hit. A political satire, which, along with other comedies of the period, helped people keep their sanity, something we will be needing more and more of in the coming times. The solemn Herbert Hoover, who was clueless about what to do during the crisis, said in 1929, "The cure for unemployment is to find jobs." Not too profound. A bit more memorable was this remark by Hoover: "Blessed are the young, for they shall inherit the national debt." Very true that it is today. Do you know who was the most famous of the humorists who helped cheer up the nation during that period, the Great Depression? Will Rogers, yeah. Others were probably Robert Benchley, James Thurber, and the poet Ogden Nash. Another major figure, often witty, was more a serious man, the Baltimore journalist H.L. Mencken, who said, "A good politician is quite as unthinkable as an honest burglar." Opinions about politics are really very negative, and it's interesting how many of the politicians themselves say negative things about themselves. Then there was Dorothy Parker, the only female member of the Algonquin Round Table of the 1930s and 40s. She's still remembered for her clever one-liners. She wasn't a political figure, really, but associated with all sorts of bigwigs. She was operating at a time when women were generally not expected to be funny. Interesting. But she could be spontaneously witty, as when the desk clerk of the Algonquin called her room and asked, "Mrs. Parker, do you have a gentleman in your room?" And she replied, "I don't know. Wait a minute, I'll ask him."
Jerry mentioned Will Rogers, who was a native of Oklahoma. He did one-man sold-out performances, of course, in the 20s and 30s, and was known as the cowboy philosopher. He was a high school dropout, yet wrote 6 books and 4,000 newspaper columns, while also doing radio broadcasts and making 71 movies. He appeared on stage with only a lasso and charmed his audiences with Cracker Barrel wit. By the way, do you know his most famous remark? That's right. I never met a man I didn't like. Right. Yeah. And then these are some of the others that have gone down in history. "I belong to no organized political party," he said. Can you finish this famous quote? I'm a Democrat, right? "Our Constitution protects aliens, drunks, and U.S. senators." "There's no trick to being a humorist when you have the whole government working for you." "I don't make jokes. I just watch the government and report the facts." "My jokes don't hurt anybody. You can take them or leave them. But with Congress, every time they make a joke, it becomes a law, and every time they make a law, it's a joke." Alexander Hamilton started the U.S. Treasury with nothing, and that was the closest our country has ever been to being even.
Will Rogers also said, "Let us be thankful that we're not getting all the government we're paying for." The income tax has made more liars out of the American people than golf ever has. Here's a remark worthy of Oscar Wilde: "A fool and his money are soon elected."
You can lead a fool to Congress, but you can't make him
Wait a minute, that was Milton Berle, not Will Rogers.
How about this one? A bureaucrat is a Democrat who holds some office a Republican once.
No, that was said by Alben Barkley, Truman's vice president. We'll come back to him in just a few moments. Who would think of Henry Kissinger as saying anything funny? But I do have one of his, and I'm going to try to imitate him as best I can. I believe that 90% of the politicians give the other 10% a bad name. Sounds like Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think, more than than Henry. But what's clever, what I like about a comment like that is the way it inverts what we expect. And Oscar Wilde is famous for things like work is the curse of the drinking class, that sort of thing where it's twisted around. Another Kissingerism, the longer I am out of office, the more infallible I appear to myself. Both parties seem adept at political humor and at sex scandals. I won't mention anything recent, but do you remember the distinguished gentleman from Arkansas, Wilbur Mills, powerful chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and his affair with a stripper named Fanny Fox? Who could forget Fanny? Do you remember what she did when a policeman stopped the inebriated Mills one night when he was driving in the nation's capital? She jumped into the tidal basin. Yeah. Wayne Hayes had a mistress named Elizabeth Ray, whom he put on the federal payroll, even though, as she said memorably, I can't type, I can't file, I can't even answer the phone. Do you know what prompted this otherwise talented woman to go public with their affair? Well, she was upset because she wasn't invited to Hayes' wedding to another of his secretaries. David, you have a Lyndon Johnson story, I believe.
Yes, I do, Jerry. LBJ was reminded of a story that the Postmaster General told him about, getting a letter from a little boy who had lost his father and whose widowed mother was having difficulty making ends meet. He wrote a letter to God. Dear God, please send Mom $100 to help with the family. The letter wound up on the desk of the Postmaster General, who was so touched by it that he took a $20 bill out of his pocket and sent it to the little boy by airmail. 2 weeks later, he got a letter in return. Dear God, much obliged for all you have done, but we need another 100. And if you don't mind, when you send it to Mama, please don't route it through Washington because they deducted 80% of it last time. There was a time when LBJ went to this banquet in New York. It was a full dress, and he was speaking, of course, afterwards. It might have been the DNC, I don't know. But you've all heard, of course, of former governor of New York, Al Smith, the first Catholic to run for president in 1928 against Hoover. Didn't matter that he was electorally murdered, but anyway, Lyndon said, "It is good to be here in this great city of New York that gave our nation the great artist of repartee, whom we know as Al Smith. You know, once Al was making a speech, and a heckler yelled, 'Tell 'em all you know, Al, it won't take long.' Al answered, 'I'll tell 'em all we both know, and it won't take any longer.'" Johnson's prodigious ego inspired an apocryphal story, an imaginary scenario in which Germany's visiting chancellor, Ludwig Erhard, allegedly remarked, "I understand, Mr. President, you were born in a log cabin." "No," replied Johnson, "you have me confused with Lincoln. I was born in a manger."
That's one of the few non-historical anecdotes, just a little joke that somebody made up. Harry Truman was greatly underestimated as vice president and surprised many when he became president in 1945, succeeding FDR, and of course delighted everybody, or many people, with his earthy humor on his daily walks, whether in Independence, Missouri, or in Washington. He delighted reporters with these salty comments. He said, "My choice early in life was either to be a piano player in a whorehouse or a politician. And to tell the truth, there's hardly any difference." In politics, you learn always be sincere even if you don't mean it. He took his job seriously, but never himself, which is why I think maybe he's valued now more than he was when he held office. Truman said, "A politician is a man who understands government. A statesman is a politician who has been dead 15 years." He also said, "Anybody who's had the job I've had and didn't have a sense of humor wouldn't still be here." After he got settled in Washington as a new senator from Missouri, he said, for the first 6 months, you wonder how the hell you ever got here. For the next 6 months, you wonder how the hell the rest of them got here." He also said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. When he was asked about his give him hell reputation, Truman said, "I never did give anybody hell. I just told the truth and they thought it was hell."
New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey was the heavy favorite, as you know, in 1948's presidential race against Harry Truman. On election night, the story goes that Dewey asked his wife, "How will it feel to sleep with the President of the United States?" She replied, "A high honor, and quite frankly, I'm looking forward to it." Truman, however, won the election, and the next morning at breakfast, Mrs. Dewey said to the governor, "Tell me, Tom, am I going to Washington or is Harry coming here tonight?" Since Truman was going to be defeated anyway, it was thought, who cared that he chose the obscure Alben Barkley of Kentucky as his running mate? Barkley was known as among the best hog callers in the bluegrass state and admitted to a natural inclination to start making a speech anytime he saw as many as 6 people assembled together. Having a loud voice and wit, Barkley naturally went into politics. He was a popular fellow. At age 70, he thought himself too old to be president, but ideally suited for the lower standards of the vice presidency. After working hard to get Truman elected, he enjoyed the perks of office and found that being VP was a good way to meet women. When his Playboy reputation was mentioned, he said, quote, "The difference between the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is that senators, like vice presidents, are too old to have affairs, they only have relations." He spent most of his time in the Senate writing love letters to a 38-year-old lady from St. Louis, whom he later married.
And now we turn to that delightful man of few words, Calvin Coolidge, whose motto seemed to be, in his own immortal words, "If you don't say anything, you won't repeat yourself." Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the daughter of Teddy, wondered if Coolidge had been weaned on a pickle. Silent Cal was stingy with words and with money. He even kept his marriage plans to himself, neglecting to tell the bride-to-be until the wedding day. Someone said, when Coolidge opens his mouth, a moth flies out. When he smiles, it's like ice breaking on a New England river. In one of his longer public statements, Coolidge declared during the 1924 campaign, "I think the American public wants a solemn ass for president, and I think I'll go along with them." A lady at a dinner party wagered that she could get Cal to say more than 2 words. He responded, "You lose."
When he went to a state dinner at the White House, Will Rogers bet a man he could make Coolidge laugh. So when Rogers' turn came in the receiving line and he was introduced as Mr. Rogers, he put out his hand to Coolidge saying, "And your name, sir?" The president broke down and howled. And Coolidge could be intentionally clever. During a recital at the White House by an opera singer, who was giving a dreadful performance. An aide whispered to President Coolidge, "What do you think of the singer's execution?" He replied, "I'm all for it." Shortly after President Coolidge had gone to the White House, Mrs. Coolidge was unable to join him, as usual, in attending church one Sunday. At lunch, she asked the president what the sermon was about. "Sin," he said. "Well, what did the minister say about it?" "He was against it."
And when he was urged to sign an increase in spending on military aviation, the cost-conscious Coolidge asked his cabinet, "Why can't we just buy one airplane and have all the pilots take turns?" In 1930, when he was out of office, Coolidge was still being Coolidge. When a great many people are unable to find work, he said, unemployment results. When asked why someone who hated small talk so much would attend so many dinner parties, he replied, "Got to eat somewhere." And when he died in 1933, Dorothy Parker said famously,
"How can they tell?" When Huey Pierce Long was governor of Louisiana, he kidded Texas Governor James Pa Ferguson, quote, "If there had been a back door at the Alamo," Long said, "there wouldn't have been a Texas." "But there was a back door," Ferguson replied, "and that's why there's a Louisiana."
Much closer to our own time, there's a story told of George Bush the Elder visiting a nursing home during the 1992 re-election campaign. He was dismayed that none of the residents seemed very impressed to see him, President of the United States and all that. So he asked one old lady, "Do you know who I am?" And she said, "No, but the nurse there will tell you who you are." I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a wonderful story. Several notorious mayors have said wonderful things too. When Frank Rizzo, who's no relation to our own Joe Rizzo, but Joe does have a wonderful story about the possible connection there. They're both Philadelphia boys. When Frank Rizzo was mayor of Philadelphia, he said, "The streets of our city are safe. It's only the people who make them unsafe." Perhaps you remember another well-known mayor called Marion Barry in the nation's capital, who once proclaimed, "There are two kinds of truths, real truths and made-up truths." Sounds like Blagojevich speaking. No wonder he ended up in jail. He also said, outside of the killings, Washington, D.C. has one of the lowest crime rates in the nation.
Winston Churchill once referred to an opponent this way: "He has all the virtues I dislike and none of the vices I admire." While in America, Churchill was invited to a buffet luncheon where cold fried chicken was served. Returning for a second helping, he asked politely, "May I have some breast?" Overhearing this, his hostess scolded him. "Mr. Churchill, in this country we ask for white meat or dark meat." Churchill apologized. The following morning, he sent the lady a magnificent orchid with a note that read, "I would be most obliged if you would pin this to your white meat."
After he gave his famous address in Fulton, Missouri, a buxom woman approached Churchill and gushed, "Oh, Mr. Churchill, I've traveled more than 100 miles this morning for the unveiling of your bust." And he replied, "Madam, I assure you that I would gladly return the favor." George Bernard Shaw, the famous playwright, once invited Churchill to the premiere of a new play, his new play, enclosing 2 tickets, one for yourself and one for a friend, he said, if you have one. And Churchill wrote back, saying he couldn't make it, but maybe he could have tickets for the second night, if there is one.
Churchill's wartime partner, FDR, loved to tell the story of the Wall Street executive who would buy a newspaper each morning, look at the front page, swear, and throw the unread paper in the trash can. One day, the newspaper stand operator asked the executive what he was doing day after day. "I'm looking for an obituary," said the businessman. "But sir, obituaries aren't on the front page, they're toward the back." "Son," said the executive, "you better believe the obituary I'm looking for will be on the front page." On one occasion, Eleanor Roosevelt left the White House to visit a prison. She left so early in the morning that she decided not to disturb the president. Shortly after he got up, FDR called Mrs. Roosevelt's secretary, Mrs. Thompson, to ask where his wife was. Mrs. Thompson responded, "Oh, Mr. President, she's in the prison, sir." And he said, "Well, I'm not surprised, but what for?" Roosevelt was a master at coddling difficult colleagues. Harold Ickes, his temperamental Secretary of the Interior, was widely criticized for fuel shortages on the East Coast during the winter of 1941. FDR took it upon himself to mollify the prickly secretary with a presidential limerick. There was a lady of fashion who had a terrific passion. As she jumped into bed, she casually said, "Here's one Ickes can't ration."
Well, it certainly seems that politics and humor do go together naturally, since it's impossible to take everything that candidates for office say seriously. Eventually, many of these candidates get elected and end up making history. And we know that history is the record of past achievement, good and bad, tragic and comic. Unless we look at this history with a sense of humor and cope with our own times, I guess, and with the same sense of humor, it's easy to become depressed. Ronald Reagan summed up what we find in many public careers when he said, "Politics is not a bad profession. If you succeed, there are many rewards. If you disgrace yourself, you can always write a book." And I'm sure we can be on the lookout this year for at least 1 or 2 bestsellers.
Sam Rayburn, legendary Speaker of the House until his death in 1961, having heard a lot of verbiage in Congress, said, "No one has a finer command of language than the person who keeps his mouth shut." So we can end on that note, except for that question I asked you all earlier tonight. Who was the celebrity entertainer who ran for president on a third-party label in 1940 and the name of his or her party? Does anybody know the answer to that? No? Good guess. Anybody? All right.
It's a woman.
No? He died in the 20s. But, no? All right. Going once, twice, not sold. Okay. The person was that half of that famous Burns and Allen team, Gracie Allen. And you know what the name of her party was? The Surprise Party. And I have a list of all the marvelous planks in it, one of which just stuck out. One of her planks included settling the boundary dispute between California and Florida. Now, I know you're all saying this. I love a finished speaker. I really do. Not one who's polished, but one who's through. And ladies and gentlemen, we're through, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Well done. Well done.